Hi everybody, my name is Oliver and welcome to part 2 of my broken clavicle diary. I am going to do a little bit of a verbal introduction to this video. If you're wanting to skip straight ahead to the actual physical movements, I've put a link in the description. Click on the timestamp, it will take you straight there. Otherwise, a little bit more background on what's been happening for me. 13 days ago, I fell off my mountain bike and I broke my clavicle. And I thought it might be interesting to throw some light on my recovery process, as I'm a yoga teacher and a practicing yogi, and I'm wanting to try and use my practice to help me recover from this injury. Now, I was going to show you my whole practice. I've been practicing for 30 to 40 minutes every day since I came off the bike, but as my YouTube account is so new, I can only post videos up to I think 15 minutes. So I decided to break the practice into chunks, and today we're going to be looking at something called joint movements. Joint movements are a sequence of movements that I learnt during my teacher training with Bharat Shetty of India Yoga. I've linked that in the description as well if you're interested in seeing more about Bharat. And they've been really good for me. What I would say is this is my experience. I'm just documenting what worked for me. Obviously take the advice of the doctors and the physios perhaps that you're dealing with. Leading on from that, the day after my accident, the hospital actually called and said don't wear your sling all the time. And so I've decided that my yoga practice is going to be one of those parts of the day where I take the sling off. You'll notice I'm not wearing the sling right now, I'm wearing a figure of 8 brace. It pulls the shoulders open, corrects posture, and it's also, I've researched this, it's meant to be really good for drawing the clavicle pieces into a place where they're going to hopefully align better. So this video is for, I'm looking at my watch because I'm about to teach a class. This video is for anyone who has broken a collarbone. Maybe they feel all at sea, they don't know how they can move their body safely and maybe get a bit of movement back into their day. This is for teachers who've got students who've got something similar and don't know how to handle it. And this is for people who are just interested, maybe yogis, non-yogis alike. Just focus on the breath, keep the breath at the center of the practice, and I'll show you what I've been up to. The day after my accident, the osteo clinic phoned and advised I didn't wear the sling for the whole day, that I would take it off at certain points, and I decided my yoga practice would be a good opportunity to do this. You can see me wearing my sling now, the shoulder is immobilized, the arm is crossing the stomach horizontally. However, I realized if I removed the sling and held onto my stomach lightly with my right hand, I was actually able to keep my arm in the same position. The shoulder was still immobilized, I was making sure it wasn't rolling forward. It required a little more conscious thought on my part because the sling was no longer just keeping my arm hanging there, I had to be aware of what I was doing. But this was quite liberating, as I had found the sling was contributing to some back pain over the first 7 to 10 days, and being able to stand without it and keeping the shoulders safe was quite a relief. Advancing from this, after 3 or 4 days, I was taking my hand down to the side of the body for certain parts of the practice. This is definitely a less stable position as the shoulder was no longer immobilized by the hand clutching the stomach, and so I had to be more conscious of what I was doing with my shoulder when my hand was down by the side of the body. But saying that, it allowed me to open up the elbow, which was a real relief having had it shut throughout the whole night wearing a sling and shut throughout most of the day walking around in the sling. The final hand position I employed throughout my practice felt really stable. Here I interlaced my fingers and clasped my stomach with both hands. As you can see, it's very symmetrical, both arms and shoulders seem to be in the same position, and I normally went for this if I was exploring a part of the practice that I wasn't very sure of yet, I wasn't 100% sure how it was going to go, or if I just woke up feeling really low in energy. So in summary, these were the hand positions I explored and used during my adapted yoga practice, and I would just basically go for whichever one felt right at that moment and at that time. Moving into the joint movements proper, I began by raising my right foot from the floor and just moving the toes. This is exactly the same as your classic joint movements from the beginner series that Bharat Shetty developed. I lifted the foot up, kept the leg as straight as I could manage, but you could bend the knee if you wished, and then you set that down and you lift up the left foot. I tried to lift the leg as high as I could because this is one of the few points in the day and one of the few parts of my body that I could still employ some strength. I felt fairly weak through every other part of my body, but my legs were still strong, so I enjoyed trying to lift up my legs as high as I could, keeping the standing legs straight and strong, and just moving the toes as much as felt comfortable really. It didn't have to be for as long as I'm doing it now. I think at the beginning I maybe did it for 5 seconds on each foot. Moving on to ankle movements. Again, I would raise my right foot from the floor, and this time I would revolve my ankle clockwise for a number of times, and then anti-clockwise. The number of times I did this really depended on the day. In the first few days it was probably only 5 or 6 times in each direction, then I would lower the foot down. And you can see I'm exploring different hand positions here, and that was something I did throughout my practice, just finding what worked for me. If I was low on energy especially, I might just clutch my stomach like I've got that invisible sling on. As I became more confident, the arm would go down by the side of the body, just rolling the ankle and keeping that standing leg strong. With feet together, moving into knee movements, I would draw circles with my knees. I would rotate clockwise and then anti-clockwise. You can see my hands are on my quadriceps. This was not something I was doing in the first few days. This is something I built up to after maybe about 10 days. Initially I would have been clutching the stomach with the right hand, or perhaps using both hands, as you can see I'm doing right now. Of course, the knees are hinge joints, not ball and socket joints, and so when we're drawing these circles, we're not really rolling the knees, we're actually just opening them and closing them. Moving on to hip movements, I would take a shoulder width stance and make sure that my body was staying in the same place and my head was staying in the same place, whilst revolving my hips clockwise and then anti-clockwise. The number of revolutions, once again, varied on the day and how I felt. But I would say this felt really nice for me. My lower back and my glutes were getting extremely tight from sitting upright, which I had to do for the first 4 or 5 nights. And so this was a really lovely movement to explore. Drawing the feet together, I would then do finger movements. Ordinarily the hands would be up at shoulder height, but for obvious reasons I kept them down by the sides of the body. But sometimes I would actually have that hand up against the chest depending on my energy and how I felt that day. Being able to move the fingers like this in the right hand especially felt really good, because being slung all day, the hand wasn't getting used, and so there wasn't much of a chance to actually explore that dexterity of the fingers themselves. Leading on from this into wrist movements, I would roll my wrists forward a set number of times and then reverse the direction. Again, the number of times was wholly dependent on how I felt, and sometimes I would do this with my hand up at the chest in that kind of invisible sling motion. It just depended how confident I felt for the first few days. I'd say after maybe 4 or 5 days I had my hands down by the sides of the body, as it just felt so good being able to open out the elbow, having had the elbow shut for most of the day. That being said, I was always aware of what I was doing with my shoulder, making sure it wasn't slumping forward. Obviously, moving the wrists is a really good thing when your arm's stuck in a sling all day, and so this was something I spent quite a long time doing, probably more than most of the other movements up until this point. I would then open and close the elbow joint. This was something that I approached with a lot of caution, and I think in the first few days I might have just done my left arm by itself, as you can see in the demonstration right now. I also kept the angle very small. When I did involve the right arm, it started out at maybe 30 degrees, and over time I built up to bringing my fingertips right to the chest. Shoulder movements are a part of the joint movements that you would find in Bharat Shetty's beginner sequence. However, I left them out of my practice for a good long while. I didn't introduce these until maybe 10 days, maybe a little longer. I'm glad I did, because I just went to the hospital yesterday and I was actually advised to start doing stuff like this, taking it very easy of course. When I did introduce it into my own practice, the range of motion was far less than what you're seeing on camera right now. This was shot about a fortnight after the accident. I was probably going up 5 or 10 degrees and then coming down, being very cautious and very mindful the whole way through, trying not to introduce too much movement into the shoulder and therefore the clavicle. I also adapted the shoulder movement slightly. Leaning forward, I would let my arms swing out and then I would pull them back in. Again, the range of motion far reduced when I first started doing this, and I'll once again reiterate I was not doing this for the first week or 2 of my home practice. This was something I introduced very slowly and very carefully. You can see here I'm leaning forward, drawing the arms up, circling them a little, and then drawing them back to the waist. Being very careful and paying a lot of attention to how the clavicle and the shoulder feels the whole time, and building up. Finally, I moved into neck movements, and as you can see here, I'm exploring some of the different hand positions, and I would just pick and choose depending on how I felt on the day. The first set of neck movements had me looking up to the ceiling with an inhale and exhaling and looking down to the floor. I can't really overemphasize how important these felt to me during the first couple of weeks of recovery. My accident had me land on my head. I came off the bike, landed on my head and my shoulder, and my neck was just so tight afterwards to the point that swallowing food actually was painful. So being able to open up the muscles with these neck movements was so beneficial. Because of this, I would often do many repetitions and sometimes holds, depending on how I felt that morning. For the next neck movements, I would look out to the right and then out to the left. This is exactly as you'd find it in the joint movements from Bharat's beginner series. You can see here I've managed to get my hands onto my waist. This was not something I was doing the first couple of weeks. This is something I'm able to do now. It felt really strong looking out to the left, more so than the right. And sometimes I would actually hold this. I would sometimes pass through it, and sometimes I would hold it on one side and then the other. The third neck movement, you can see I'm dropping my right ear down to the right shoulder, and then the awkward side, left down to left shoulder. This was, out of all the neck movements, definitely the most uncomfortable for me, and it was the one that I was very, very careful of. I didn't want to overstretch anything in case it damaged it further, and so I built up to what you're seeing now to begin with. Very small movements, just checking in with my neck the whole time, how it felt, and making sure I wasn't making the injury worse. This final neck movement I actually added. This isn't part of what you'd find in the beginner sequence. I gave it a nickname. I called it Kissing the Bird. So imagine a bird's flying over your shoulder right now. You're looking up to the bird and you're giving it a little kiss. Down to the center, lift up, give the bird a little kiss. The reason I was doing this kissing motion is I found that a lot of the muscles are attached to your jawline, and I felt like from what I could feel in my own body, these were the muscles that were causing me a lot of problems in the initial stages after the accident. And I actually felt when I made this kiss motion with my head in this position, I felt that actually got into those muscles even more. I was, again, mindful. I was making sure I wasn't overstretching anything, but it was amazing how just jutting the jaw out into that protruding kiss motion actually intensified the stretch. And I will reiterate, I was careful with this. I didn't just go stretching my head out as far as I could and extending the jaw. This was something I built up to over days. As you can see in the demonstration, I'm holding this. This was something I liked holding. I accidentally did left side and then right in this video, I've just realised. And that's probably because the left side was so much more intense for me. And so there you have it. These are my heavily modified joint movements that I'm doing and have been doing ever since the day after the accident. And bear in mind, this is just the start of my practice. I've got a lot more to share. And so if you're interested, check out part 3, where we'll be exploring far more of the asana, postures and breathing techniques that I've been utilising on my recovery from my broken collarbone. Thanks for watching.